Hi everyone, I'm Jeevan, a program manager in the Azure Identity Organization at Microsoft. And today I'm here to take you through the two OAuth 2 endpoints that Azure AD has, that is the authorize and the token endpoint. And we'll be using those two endpoints to achieve the authorization code grant flow. Now let's jump right in. Before we begin, I would like to promise you that this won't be a death by presentation session. I only have a couple of slides, and once we look at the basic architecture, we will move on to a demo with Postman. The authorization code grant flow, I would say, has three main segments. The first segment is the application itself, which can be a mobile app, it can be a single page app, any other web app, and also the user who is using the application. And then the second segment is the authorization server. Uh, Authorization server actually has two endpoints. First one is the authorized endpoint, and the second one is the token endpoint. For this demo, we are using Azure AD as the authorization server. And then the third segment is the resource server itself. And the resource server holds a resource the user is, or the application is trying to access. And for this example, we will be using the me endpoint from Microsoft Graph as the resource server. Okay, so basically what is happening here is that the application wants to access the basic profile of the user via the me endpoint, and the application needs to get authorized to do that. An authorization code grant flow is actually the more preferred way of achieving this. There are some older mechanisms like implicit flow and stuff, but authorization grant flow is the way to go, which it is more modern, it is more secure in some ways, and it's the industry standard way to do things now. And in the authorization code grant flow, we have, I would say, kind of like three phases again on how we achieve that. The first phase is to get an authorization code or auth code. And once you get an auth code, the second phase kicks in, which is where you exchange the auth code to get an access token. And then once you have that access token, or once the application has an access token, you can exchange that access token. You can pass that access token to the resource server and get the resource that the application is interested in, which is the me endpoint or the basic profile of the user in this case. So let's look at a sequence diagram here. So the first phase, like I said, the application hits the Azure AD's authorized endpoint. And here the user will actually be presented with a login screen where they have to, enter their username and password and also provide consent uh, to the application to access this resource. So once Azure AD verifies that the information passed is right, there are some information like client ID and stuff which needs to be passed. We will look at that, the authorized endpoint call in more detail in the next slide. So once that call which was made by the application to the authorized endpoint is successfully verified, Azure AD will return the auth code in a redirect. So now the application has got the auth code from Azure AD. Now the application will make a post request to the token endpoint. So once that post request is made, again some validations happen. Again, some other parameters like the client ID, client secret needs to be passed. We'll look at that in the next slide. So meanwhile, once that validation is successful, the token endpoint, which is again a REST endpoint, will return the access token back to the application. Now in the third phase, the application has got the access token. It can make a request to the resource server for the user's basic profile, which is again the me endpoint. And this access token which we obtain from the token, the second phase is to be passed as part of the header to the resource server. And once that happens, the application can finally get access to the resource, the protected resource here, which is the user's profile. So this is authorization code grant flow in a nutshell. The application was able to uh, get access to this protected resource by signing in the user and the user consenting permission to permission to this application to get access to the protected resource of the user profile. Let's now look at the three REST endpoints involved in the flow that we saw earlier in more detail. The first endpoint is the Azure AD authorized endpoint. So the authorized endpoint has a set of parameters that it needs as request parameters. For example, the client ID, the response type, the redirect URI, response mode, scope, etc. So when we go to the demo, I'll show you how you can get all these parameters and populate that. So basically, once these parameters are defined correctly, a corresponding auth code will be given as a redirect. So if you look closely, you can see that there is a redirect URI parameter in the request. For example, in this case, it's HTTP localhost my app. So the auth code will be given will be passed on to that URL. So basically Azure AD will hit localhost slash my app in a get call and pass this auth code. Now let's look at the token endpoint. So token endpoint again needs a set of parameters like the client ID, scope, and of course the code which we obtained earlier from the authorized endpoint. And we can also mention see that the grant type is mentioned as authorization code. Client secret is also provided. So once all the parameters that it needs are satisfied, it'll give back an access token as response, again with the redirection mechanism. We have already defined the redirect URI as one of the request parameters as well. So that's the token endpoint. Now the third endpoint is the resource servers endpoint. In this case, it's the Microsoft Graph Me endpoint. So this endpoint is protected, of course, and it needs an access token, which we already obtained by hitting the token endpoint. So the third endpoint is much more simpler. You just call the endpoint and you can pass the access token as a bearer token in the authorization header. And once that is verified, uh, once the token is right, it's valid, you will get the resource, in this case the user's basic profile. So one thing to note is that for this example we are looking at the basic profile. It can be anything. It can be maybe the user's profile picture, the user's email content, it might be the user's contact list. There are so many resources which can fit in here. There'll be, of course, different APIs for that. If you look at Microsoft Graph, for example, there are different APIs for mail, contact, and stuff. But the the flow is the same, right? So this is the simplest example which I've taken, which is the basic profile, which has their first name, last name, their job title, and stuff like that. There can be, of course, more complicated resources which I talked about just earlier. If you have made it this far, I promise you the more interesting bits are yet to come. Let's now jump into the demo. As an application developer, in a real world scenario, you will be developing your own applications. But for the purpose of the demo, I'm using a tool called Postman, which is a REST client, which enables you to make REST calls. You can just go to postman.com and download and install the application. So with Postman, we'll hit the authorize, the token, and also the resource servers me endpoint. But in a real world scenario, again, when you develop an application, you will not be manually hitting these endpoints. In fact, you should not be hitting them. You should probably be using an OAuth to SDK like the Microsoft authentication library called MSAL, which has all the mechanisms to handle throttling and all those stuff. So you should leverage that. But this demo is purely for your understanding of how everything works under the hood. Let's now go to Postman and let's first try and hit the me endpoint and see what happens. Copying this in Postman, let me make a new GET request and see what happens. Okay, so we have an error response and it says access token is empty. Let's now figure out how we can add an access token to this and get the user's basic profile. Let's navigate to the Authorization tab and pick the OAuth 2 from the dropdown. So basically what Postman does is it abstracts the whole process of getting an auth code, and then using the token to hit the token endpoint and all that. So all we have to do is we have to just provide the parameters that are needed. Let's look at them one by one. The first one is of course a token name. Let us name it maybe, demo token. And then next one is the grant type. In our case, it's authorization code. Then next one is the callback URL, which is the reply URL. That's where the auth code and the token will be shared by AD. And then next one is the auth URL. So this is the URL of the authorized endpoint. Next one is the token URL. Again, URL of the token endpoint. Then the client ID, a client secret, and then a scope. So the client ID, client secret, and scope, uh, I'll talk about it in more detail soon. Basically, the client ID, we can get it from the Azure portal. Secret, we can get it from the Azure portal. And scope is really the sort of permission that this application needs to have to access a resource. For example, to access the profile of a user, the scope is uh, user.read. Maybe for to read the contacts of the user, it might be a different permission. To read the email, it'll be a different permission, read mail, so on and so forth. So in the description, I'll share the list of the entire scopes supported by Microsoft Graph. So I think next we are ready to look at how we can pull up these information, the client ID secret and stuff from the Azure portal. We're now in the app registrations page of Azure portal. Demo application is my demo app registration. And from this page, we should get all the information that we need to populate in Postman. First one is, of course, the client ID. We can get that right here. I copy that and I'm pasting it in Notepad++. We need the endpoints. We can go to the button here and then we can grab the authorize endpoint API. We have that here. Let's take the token endpoint right here. Now, I believe we need a client secret as well. To get that, let's navigate to the certificates and secrets tab. And let's create a new client secret and demo secret. And let's click add. Perfect. So our secret is here. We can copy that to Notepad. Now we also need to define the redirect URI. Let's go to the authentication tab and navigate to the redirect URIs, and you can see that redirect URI of localhost is defined here. Let's go to Postman and see. Yep, it's the same callback URI. If you don't configure this callback URI in the allow list in the redirect URI tab, it's not going to work. Okay, I believe now we have all the information that we need. Let's populate that into Postman. I have populated all the information which we copied earlier, and that's when I realized that we missed copying the scope parameter. Let's jump right back in and try to get the scope that we need. We need to go to the API permissions. And you can see the scope needed is user.read Microsoft Graph. It is already granted. I just need to copy that, and then we can put that bit here. I believe we are good to go. Let's see what happens when we click the Get New Access Token button. As you can see, when I clicked on the Get New Access Token button, a pop-up has come asking me to sign in, and I'm going to give my test account sign in, and it should ask me for the password. I'm going to enter my password. Okay, nope. Let's see if we are able to get an access token now. As you can see, we have gotten an access token, and with this access token, we should be able to access the me endpoint and get the user's profile information. Let's see. Now let's send the request and see if we are getting the response. Oops. Access tokens, demo token. Okay. See, what happened was that I got the token, but I forgot to, mention that in the access token. So from the drop down, you can ignore all these things. This is the new token that we created, demo token. We have selected that, and it'll go as a bearer token. And this time, it should work. We should get the response. And in fact, let's head over to the header tab and see. Okay, we have the token as a header. Postman has already added it. Now this time it should definitely work. Let's see what happens. Perfect. We have the user's uh, information, the display name, the mail, the user principal, and stuff. So we're able to do this because we were able to successfully authenticate and authorize and get a valid access token. Now, let's look at the access token which we just obtained in more detail, and also uh, try to understand some of the best practices associated with access tokens. I'm going to copy this entire access token, and let's navigate to this website called jot.ms or jwt.ms and see the decoded token. As you can see here, a lot of information is there. Uh, the scope is there. There should be an audience. Uh, Audience is there. Uh, App ID is there. And this is how we can view the content of the token. One very important thing here is that these access tokens are actually opaque, and unless you are the resource server, right? Unless you are the resource server, you're not supposed to pass these access tokens. Today, I'm able to go to jaw.ms and pass and view the content of the access token, but there's no guarantee that it will be that way tomorrow. The implementation might change and they might encrypt it, and then you will not be able to view this at all. So your business logic should not have anything which goes and reads the access token and does some manipulation based on that, unless you are the audience, unless you are the resource owner and this token is issued for you, which is not the case in many scenarios. I've seen a lot of people make that mistake of passing the token which is meant for Microsoft Graph and then doing some business logic based on that. Please don't do that. It's a wrong way of doing things. Unless you're the audience for the token, you're not meant to manipulate the token at all. You're just supposed to treat it as an opaque entity and just pass it on to whoever who needs that. For example, the me endpoint, and don't try to fiddle with the token at all. Quick summary: we wanted to have access to the me endpoint and get a user's basic profile. We could not do it initially because we did not have the access token. Then we populated all the information from Azure portal to Postman, and then we finally got an access token and also access to the basic profile of the user. We also had a closer look inside the access token, and we learned that we should treat access token as opaque unless it is meant for us or unless we are the audience for that token, which is not the case most of the time. So basically, we should treat it as opaque entities and pass it on to the resource server. Thank you so much for watching the video. And if you found the content useful, please like the video and also subscribe to my channel. Feel free to ask any questions that you have on the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer all of them. Thank you.